Coming up on today's episode of the Salesman podcast.
But the net of it is the way that most companies are, business to business organizations are set up, and at their price points, no sale happens without a conversation.
Hello, Sales Nation. I'm Will Barron, host of the Salesman podcast. As always, and welcome to today's show. On today's show, we have Steve Richard, who is a conversation expert. That's exactly what we're diving into today, sales conversations and how probably underutilized as a tool. And you can learn more about Steve over at ExecVision.io. And over there, they do a lot of monitoring, they do a lot of data tracking conversations, and that is exactly what we're diving into on today's show. So with all that said, without further ado, let's jump in to today's episode. Hey, Steve, and welcome back again to the Salesman podcast.
Third time's a charm, Will, right?
Definitely. And today we're going to dive into a whole bunch of ideas and concepts around conversations. And this sets up the very first question of, in a world where salespeople are being told to social sell, to almost market, to build their personal brands, to use tracking software, to kind of automate their emails slightly, is conversations, or are conversations, still the best kind of like bang for buck way to close deals? Is this still the core of the sales process?
And you know me, the answer is always going to be it depends on what you sell and who you sell to. But let me just elaborate on that. For example, there's a company in San Francisco called Xero, Xero. They're disrupting QuickBooks for financial software, in particular for very small businesses or particularly small businesses. So for them, a lot of the transactions happen by e-commerce with a very light touch from a salesperson, if at all, to keep the thing going. Contrast that with a big enterprise sale of multi-million dollars, where obviously conversations are critically important. But the net of it is the way that most companies are, business to business organizations are set up, and at their price points, no sale happens without a conversation. And I'm quoting a guy named Chris Beal at Connect and Sell there when I say that. Show me a sale that happens without a conversation. So absolutely, it's critically important. Now, if you think about the top of funnel, Will, and the top of funnel is where we see a lot of the social prospecting, social selling, emailing that people are doing to generate an initial appointment. And you're seeing this whole host of email semi-automation tools like the Sales Lofts and the Outreaches of the world, and the Tout apps and Yeswares and all the rest of them, and InsideSales.com. But what we're seeing with that is, sure, you can generate interest and attention at the top of the funnel, but you have to then have a conversation to get that thing converted into a qualified opportunity that advances through the funnel. The sale doesn't happen without the conversation.
Just on that, Steve, because this is something that comes up all the time on the show. It's pretty much a 50-50 split on people's thoughts and opinions. And I want this question to be referencing B2B sales as a whole, not necessarily just the SaaS Silicon Valley side of things, but which is more effective? And of course, I know your answer is going to be depends, but overall, which is more effective? Sending out 100 emails that are semi-automated to semi-qualified prospects, or sending out perhaps, which takes about the same amount of time, 10 emails where you've really developed the email, you've really put yourself into it, you're having you're leading a conversation rather than spamming to book an appointment. Which of those generally is going to be more effective?
Yeah, it depends on the quality of opportunity that ensues. But the answer is, as much as I hate to say it, the answer is the semi-automated play, as long as there's a touch of customization, will be better. If you're in a volume type of a sale where you need to put up quantity, you can't just rely on 2 or 3 massive opportunities, then there's no chance that you're going to hand write everything from scratch the way you're talking about with those 10, perfectly customized emails. So the data tells us, it's not my opinion. The beautiful thing is, I've got a lab, Will. I've got 35 people that do this for a living that we can study and test and measure everything. So the unfortunate answer, I think, maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, is 100 semi-automated, slightly customized emails will always beat 10, just because of the 10x factor, 10 perfectly from the ground up. The exception to that rule being, if you're someone who's selling to, for example, maybe 50 target accounts in your patch, or you're an account manager, has a small number of strategic accounts. In those instances, all the data and research tells us that you have to do everything from scratch. I can't remember who I was listening to the other day, but they had some really good data on that about how the top salespeople in the world who make the biggest money, they don't ever start with a template at all. There's no template. They always, and if you study what they do, they always write everything, every word of every email specifically tailored for that particular individual.
And what kind of industry would that be? Give us an example of one of the top salespeople in the world. What would they be selling?
Yeah, usually it'll be like an enterprise CRM, enterprise ERP software type of a salesperson that goes after or has a very small number of strategic accounts. But that could apply in a variety of other fields too. If you're selling engineering services, if you're selling, again, anything where you're selling and you're depending on that company to spend a lot of money with you. When the company spends a lot of money with you, the expectation is you're really, really going to know their business as a salesperson.
Yeah, the reason I ask that is because every time we talk about money on the show, we get a really good response, one thing, so it's slightly selfish in that. But then two, I know that the audience, if they're responding, their ears are picking up, and perhaps, well, not perhaps, I know for a fact from polling the audience that they're all looking for kind of upward mobility in sales. They're always looking to improve their position in the job market and to perhaps not go into management, which has been the classical approach for successful salespeople. They are becoming more and more aware. I'm told from feedback that managers need a different set of skills to salespeople. Great salespeople don't always make great managers. It's been my history in the past that I've had great managers and I've had poor managers, and it's generally the good salespeople that make poor managers, and the average salespeople then end up being great managers because they find out that they're great in management at the end of the day. But all that aside, the reason I ask is that a lot of the audience, I get questions every day from the audience asking, what's the next step for me? I'm in medical devices. What's the next step? I'm in this. What's the next step? So it's interesting to get the feedback on that. In that, should we, if you're a salesperson listening to this, you want to improve perhaps the opportunity for the take-home money at the end of the year, should we be moving more towards jobs where conversations are at the center of it rather than jobs where spam and follow-up and pestering is at the center of it, if that makes sense?
Absolutely. It makes total sense. And the answer is an unequivocal yes. I'll tell you, I'm going to tell you a story about a salesperson that I work with. And she came from an organization I'm not going to name. And in that organization, she was an inside salesperson. So she started in a very volume transactional average deal size, $6,000 to $8,000 or pounds, if you will, per year. And you do a volume of that. You do a lot of those deals. She ended up closing one of the largest deals in the company's history via an inside sales approach where she didn't have any support from the field whatsoever. Now, one would think that that company would praise the heck out of her and make her an example for everybody else and uncap her commissions and all that. To the contrary, they did the exact opposite. They gave much of the credit for the sale to the field, even though the field had nothing to do with it, and they capped her commission, because the reality is the field people, who are that more highly paid, home office, senior, tenured, seasoned people, they don't like it when inside sales closes a big deal like that when they're not involved. And sometimes there's politics in the organization where they go, well, wait a minute, I thought anything over 25K, I was supposed to be involved in that as well. So the message for the listeners here, if you're a salesperson listening to this, the first thing is you got to stay close to the money and where the big money is in companies. Because if senior executives, and this is just the truth, Will, this is just me being like, here's the cold hard fact. When senior executives are trying to figure out who they're going to cut in the midst of a merger or a financing round or whatever it might be, the person who manages lots of dollars, big strategic accounts and lots of dollars, even if their job is easier, frankly, a lot of times their jobs are easier because they kind of have their accounts on autopilots. They can renew them and get a little bit of more money, and they know they have the relationships. Those people get more money, though, because when the leaders are going, oh, crap, well, Susie over there is managing a $10 million book of business, but then we have this inside salesperson over here that's closing $350K a year. I can swap out someone closing $350K a year in new business whenever I want, but boy, her relationships are deep on that 10 million. We cannot afford to lose that 10 million book of business. Let's give her a raise and get rid of half the inside sales force. And those things do happen sometimes in some companies. Now, other companies, the other trend are saying, hey, this field model is a dying animal, and we're going to bring more of these people inside, and we're going to use more of an inside sales driven approach where the manager sometimes goes and travels in the field, or there's a little bit of a hybrid model. So what I recommend you do as a salesperson is start with number one, what's the industry? What are the industries that are trending? Where are the big dollar industries? I know a lot of people in media, for example. Media is not a trending industry. If you think about all the changes that happened in media over time, it's going to be really hard to find a media sales job out there where you can make $1 million a year. It just is. Versus if you're selling enterprise software, that's where all the economy is going. It'll be much easier to find it there. So start with the industry. And then when you look inside of the industry, then the next thing should be talk to a couple salespeople in different jobs in that company. Sales development is usually the entry point where you do the appointment setting and stuff for new business. Quota carrying inside salespeople that are more transactional. Field mid-market enterprise salespeople, strategic accounts, account managers, the farmers versus the hunters. Understand the different selling roles and understand what's required and understand where all the dollars are coming from. Because if you put yourself close to the money, you're going to make a lot more money.
And I don't want to gloss over this, Steve. For the people listening now, they want to get into those more account management roles, perhaps, as you alluded to then, where you've kind of got a bit of job security because they know if they sack you, which is similar to what happened to me with one role. I moved from one medical device company to their biggest competitor and moved from one end of the country. Obviously, the UK is tiny, but I moved to the other side and I brought a whole load of business with me. And it was a bad move for the other company to. I didn't get sacked or anything. I wanted to move up north, and there was no positions. But they should have made me a position. They should have done something, and it would have been just in the amount of business I brought from one company to the other. It would have been well worth giving me a raise as well. My kind of income for the year was insignificant versus the amount of turnover that I generated for this new company. Without wanting to sound big-headed, I was only ever pretty good as a salesperson. I was never amazing. But this obviously can happen with the audience who are listening. But if you're in a SDR position, you listen to this. If you're into a non-account management position and you don't have these deeper relationships with customers, is the message here underlying the last 10 minutes of our conversation that that's where you should be, and you should be in the same industry for a number of years, building long-term relationships and being focused on that rather than perhaps jumping from company to company to just get that little incremental pay raise?
Get yourself, it is the message, Will. The message is get yourself in the right industry first. If it's all about money for you, which for some people it's not, but if it's all about money for you, get yourself in the right industry first and then get yourself in the right role in the right industry. Now, I know some industries where the hunters get paid way more than the farmers. So if you bring in, $1 million new account, they comp you out big time on that account. You get, and I think of someone like an Eloqua back in the day, where they were selling marketing automation, then they were acquired by Oracle. That's a perfect example of a company where the comp plan totally changed when it was an expansion stage tech company. Eloqua out of they're headquartered in Virginia where I live, but they really had all their operations out of Toronto. When they were on their rocket ship path, they were paying big bucks to people like Jill Rowley, who was, the Ella Queen. She was the big time sales rep there. And there were a lot of other big time enterprise sales reps that were making in the seven figures because they had to grow the company. And where they were in their company's trajectory at that point was growth. They have to grow the company. They're going to comp on new logos. Now, compare or contrast that with someone like an Oracle who will probably have a different approach where, as opposed to the pure rocket ship growth, they're going to be looking more for not churning the existing accounts and growing the existing accounts. And they're going to put a premium on that. So it's not just about the industry. It's not just about the company and where they are in their life cycle and the role. It's all of those things that come together. So just study it. I guess the bigger takeaway for people is, I know a lot of salespeople will. I don't know of any salespeople who have ever said, some junior salesperson approached me to ask me career advice. If you're a junior salesperson, it's pretty easy to approach, and this goes back to our conversation. It's pretty easy to go find people in different sales roles in industries and companies that you think would be a good fit for you, and then start asking them questions about How did you get here? Why? What roles are the most highly compensated roles? What are viewed as being the most valuable? What skills do I need to get into those roles? So that's the kind of career advice, but then pivoting it back to conversations, Will. One thing all of the highly paid, highly compensated sales professionals have in common is the ability to understand how to execute a conversation with a buyer. You have to have the ability. And unfortunately, one of the outcroppings I've seen now, Aaron Ross. Do you know Aaron Ross? He wrote the book Predictable Revenue. I love Aaron Ross. I love predictable revenue. It was great. It shined a great big light on sales development, and it's really sparked the sales development movement. Beautiful. One of the problems with that approach, and I've seen this company after company, is SDRs that are sitting there and just managing this email flow and this email cadence, in many cases have what I call conversation atrophy. And what I mean by that is just like a muscle will atrophy if you don't use it, so your voice literally atrophies if you don't use it. And sometimes you go into these operations and you don't ever hear any of the SDRs on phones. And when you talk to the SDRs, they don't know how to carry a business conversation. And they're looking to move into the next role. And big shocker, the ones who actually cold called, like Jack Welch did from GE back in the day, those are the people that end up being very successful in the next sales roles, because if you can have a cold call conversation with someone who doesn't want to talk to you and turn it into a conversation, you could probably sell, right? You can have a regular conversation, versus if you never have that experience, it's much harder for that type of SDR to make that pivot into the next quota carrying job. So just some thoughts there on conversation.
Yeah, and let me ask you a really purposefully hugely open-ended question here. But what is the difference between a great sales conversation and a poor sales conversation?
So this is the beautiful thing about this, Will, is it's not my opinion. There is actually science behind this. And I'll give you a couple of the rules of communication. These come from my mentor, a guy named Tom Snyder. He's also my business partner in a company called Funnel Clarity. It's the old sales training business. They now renamed it Funnel Clarity. 2 rules of communication. Number 1, people value more what they ask for than what's freely offered. So people value more what they ask for than what's freely offered. Number 2, people value more what they conclude for themselves than what they're told. So people value more what they conclude for themselves than what they're told. So then it becomes a question of, how do I get people to ask things of me, ask for me to help them rather than me telling them I'm going to help them? And how do I get people to figure things out on their own? And the answers to both of those questions come back to tactical skills, actually concrete skills that you can observe a salesperson doing or not doing. And I'll give you some examples of what I mean by those skills. One tactical skill that you can observe is empathy. And we're seeing that within the analysis we're doing in ExecVision, where we're analyzing conversations, we're turning conversations through machine transcription with machine learning. We're turning them into transcriptions and data. So in the analysis we're doing, we're seeing that one of the early indicators is showing is that empathy is critically important. Just simply the word "I understand" provides a significant sales lift versus when the word when understand is not said. So empathy is critically important. Asking questions, of course, it's not a big shocker, but what we're seeing is higher performers have the customer and prospect talking more than lower performers. Not surprised to hear that. You and I sitting here and talking about it. The ability to advance to a concrete and specific next step, which back in the language of Huthwaite, the old sales training company, they did spin selling. That's the old classic. Will, did you ever read Spin Selling?
I listened to it on audiobook about 10 years ago. That's as close as I got to it. At the time, a lot of it came naturally to me, so I never dove too far into the methodology of it, because when I listened to it, I just went, oh, I kind of do this already, and by total fluke more than anything else.
That's right. So I recommend people still read it. It's kind of a classic. It's like reading Catcher in the Rye in the United States. It's like a book you read, and when you're in grade school, everybody reads it, or The Great Gatsby or something. So in spin selling, they talk about an advance versus a continuation. So again, not a surprise. Higher performing salespeople are better at having uncomfortable conversations about things like money. right? So interestingly enough, when money doesn't come up in a sales conversation, it doesn't do as well than if money does come up in a sales conversation. So it's good for salespeople to feel comfortable talking about budget, funding, money, how decisions are made, those types of things throughout a variety of different sales calls throughout the process. So there are a lot of, and we could go on and on and on about the skills, pre-call research, for example, when and how you get other decision makers and stakeholders involved. There's a whole lot of different skills, but they all fundamentally boil down to a great conversation is getting people to conclude things for themselves and getting people to ask for things.
So let's go over these 2 points then. Are you saying, and I'm hesitant of using the word manipulate here because, but it does come into it to a certain extent. Are you saying that we should use certain language patterns, we should use certain ways of asking or phrasing questions to kind of put the answer, not put the answer in the person's mind, but suggest an answer and then get them to say it back to us? So you said, it's a heavy word to be used in the situation, but you are essentially manipulating them to have a realization. Or are you asking genuine questions and and you don't know the answer and you're trying to suss it out between you in a more consultative approach? Which way are you going about this? Are you trying to force the hand, or are you genuinely just trying to suss it out between you?
Well, first of all, if you're not coming from a place of being genuine and authentic and believing in what you're selling and why it can help that person, then stop selling what you're selling and go sell something else, or maybe just don't be in sales. So no one's trying to fleece anyone or pull wool over people's eyes. We're not selling snake oil here. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and that's more about a business ethics. The second thing is the way you talk about the manipulation. I'm going to use a different word. I'm going to use the science of persuasion. That's also something that Tom Snyder talks about, the science of persuasion. And if you think about persuasion, and it doesn't matter where and how it's happening in life, it's not about selling a good or a service. It could be any number of different ways you're persuading somebody else. It's helping people realize something they didn't know before the conversation started. That's a really important point. If someone comes into a conversation with a preconceived notion, and I'll give you a real example. This just happened this morning. It just happened this morning. I got an email back from a prospect who said no to my sales development rep for an appointment for ExecVision. And they said, I took a look at your website. It looks like you guys do stuff around call recording. And this woman was at one of the screen sharing vendors. Okay, so like a Join Me, Clear Slide, Blue Jeans, Uber conference kind of a place. I'm not going to name which one. And she said, all of our sales calls happen on our own product, so we don't do call recording. Okay, now think about that. She has when she hears call recording, she has a very specific idea in her mind of what call recording is, and she says it does not apply to me. What she doesn't realize is that ExecVision also integrates with their product and ingests the recordings of all the screen sharing meetings, of all the web conferencing meetings, of all the video conferencing meetings, actually a Skype interaction like this will. We can take it and suck it into our platform. So we don't care what the recording is, if it's from a phone system or from a dialer or a screen sharing tool, or even a face-to-face meeting. It doesn't matter to us. We can turn all of that into data and actionable intelligence. But the reason I bring that up is that woman had something in her mind. So my job is to help persuade her. I'm not trying to fleece her or anything, but I'm trying to persuade her and to realize, to see the world differently than she saw it before. Right now, she doesn't view those screen sharing meetings as an asset to her business. They are. Those are a business asset. And that's what I came back. So how do you do that? You reframe it using some things from like the Challenger sale, or also Vorsight BP now, Funnel Clarity talks about. How do you form a preface for a question? And that's a key thing that people don't do a good job of in sales. Form a preface for a question. So you preface your question by saying, hey, Susan, I understand how you're seeing it from the standpoint of call recording, and I know you don't do call recording. In fact, I know your product well. I understand what it does, and many of our customers use your product. The reason they're using ExecVision in your product is they want the opportunity to ingest those call recordings into ExecVision and turn them into data, which they can use right inside of their CRM. So imagine all of your screen sharing meetings being right inside of your CRM and transcribed in such a way that they turn into data and they turn into intelligence about what happened in the conversation. So I'm reframing the way she's thinking about it from the perspective of her peers, and then saying, based on this, how relevant is this for your business? How could that potentially help you do things like onboarding, better ramp time to productivity, coaching effectiveness with fewer calories and better coaching, training, those kinds of things. So you hear the difference. I think it's a really important difference is that we're not, it's not like Willy Loman. We're not doing that.
And let me just dive a little bit deeper into that for a second. And to go that step deeper, would you lead it down the funnel of if our software could work with your software, would you be interested? Or would you, which is kind of forcing her down the route of, because you know the answer at the end, or would you go down the route of how can we make this work? And then she would say essentially, I suppose it's both similar ways of going about it. She could potentially then say, well, if you built it into our software, then you go, hurrah, we can do that. Which way around is the better way to go about it?
Let me answer that question, because you asked a very direct question to me before and I didn't really answer it. When a salesperson goes into a buying or selling situation, they have to have some kind of a hypothesis. There has to be some sort of a hypothesis based on the fact that other people like them have experienced these types of things. So if we know they've experienced these types of common challenges, we can form a hypothesis about what's going on, and we can ask them questions which will lead them to that same realization that other companies had before. So to answer your question, it is absolutely, we are asking questions leading them to a place that we believe could be helpful for them. Now, along the way, based on their answers to the questions, we might find out that that hypothesis we had, that path we had thought about prior to the conversation, it isn't right. In fact, it's not a fit at all, in which case, what do? We're asking other questions to try to understand what path is the right path, and sometimes it's none of them. And when it's none of them, this is where ethics come back into it, because when it's none of them, you shouldn't try to push your product and service and be a closer. And we're not doing boiler room. And we're not doing, Wolf of Wall Street stuff here. Instead, what we're doing is helping that person realize, hey, look, based on what you said, I don't think there's anything we can do to help you out. Now, I'll tell you an interesting story on that. When I first met one of our customers for ExecVision, a guy named Gary Millwit at a company called Stone Street. I first met him at an event in Chicago, I don't know, probably 4 years ago. And when I was chatting with him, I asked him a few questions about his business. He was being very guarded, Will. So this is like a cocktail hour thing. Each of us had a beer in hand, very guarded. And I asked him several questions, and I said, you know what, Gary, based on what you just said, I don't have anything to sell you. And he said, the whole tone of the thing changed, and the guard went down, and he's like, oh, that was awesome. He goes, and he's like, you're my friend for life now. And we really have become friends for life. I've been to his house in Annapolis. We've been on a boat together. And then, ironically, later on, he ended up, when I had a technology, once I had something to sell him, he bought it. And he didn't even think twice and bought it, and knock on wood, he's about to renew right now, right? So it just goes to show that the salespeople who do the best in their careers, who make the most money and all that sort of stuff, they're doing right by the buyer, by their customers as well. And how are they doing that? They're influencing by leading them down a path. But if the path isn't there, they're telling them the path's not there. And that becomes a very powerful way to generate referrals too. And that's the thing that salespeople do a bad job of. As soon as they hear that path's not there, a lot of salespeople go, okay, I got nothing to sell you. Good luck. Instead, I said, I got nothing to sell you, but who do you know? And he gave me 3 referrals right then and there to people he knew who would be good fits based on what we were talking about.
So this leads me to the final question I want to ask you in this part of the show, Steve, and that is, does every conversation need to push the buyer or the prospect down the funnel? Does every conversation need to have a hypothesis and an end goal of the conversation, or is it okay to have, to call people to try and add value just for the sake of adding value and building relationships? Because I think there's some people that are, especially in the bigger, more complex B2B sales, there's people who go down the route of relationships, everything, that's all that matters at the end of the day. And then you get, as you described them, then the closers who perhaps on the other end of the scale, who only call people when they've got something to perhaps offer them value, but to move them further down the process. Is there a right and wrong way to this? And I guess the question I'm asking is, as a rule, should every conversation be pushing people along?
Yeah, I'm going to divide that into 2 pieces, because the science tells us that every conversation has to have a purpose. And in fact, that's one of the words we're looking at and studying right now is the word purpose or agenda. We want to hear the beginning of calls to understand how are salespeople starting that call and setting expectations for what that conversation is all about. What's the purpose of the call? Now, the purpose of the call could be, the purpose for this call today is to network, Will, and for me to understand what's going on in your business so I can point you in some directions, because I believe, based on what I've learned, there's nothing I can do to help you out. So let me see if we can do that instead. And then when you grow and get a little bit bigger and you have over 10 sales reps, perhaps we can talk then. That's a purpose. So I just want to clarify, a purpose for a call we believe is critical. We have not started analyzing that yet. Full stop. Point number 2, lots of times the purpose for the call is to pull people back up the funnel. So it's not always pushing people down the funnel. Sometimes it's pulling people back up the funnel. Why would you do it? Let me ask you, Will, why do you think you'd want to give me an example of a time when you would want to reverse the funnel and get someone to go and pull their buying journey back a little bit and reframe it?
Using my own experience in medical device sales, if I'd perhaps not gone high enough up the food chain with my initial prospecting, and I was perhaps doing a smaller deal than what could have been put in place. I never did, but it would have been smart to go back up the funnel, perhaps start again, and rope more people in more theaters, more departments, perhaps.
Exactly, because what happens is sometimes there's a buyer. That's a great example.
It's a great example, but it's something I was very poor at doing. It's only with hindsight.
No, but this is how you get better, right? A very common situation is you'll have a buying committee or multiple buying influences. Corporate Executive Board research says on average it's 5 to 7 per sale, depending on the price point. So let's pretend for a minute that it's 4. And you're talking to whoever that person is, who's the point person on that buying committee to talk to you, and they're talking to you about something very specific, some kind of very specific medical devices they need. Great. Well, one of the things you might want to do is find out, well, hold on a second here, because one of the things I learned through my research is that your doctor's group is also doing XYZ surgeries, right? Would it make sense for us to understand what your needs are going to look like there? Because ultimately, if we can bundle these things together, I could help you probably get a better cost for all those things together. How about we do this? How about we pull together the other people in the committee and not do a demonstration of capabilities for anything specific, but rather pull the people from the buying committee together to understand what your future needs are going to look like. So then that way I can get you the best price on what you're doing right now. So you're pulling people back up in the funnel. You're helping them figure out, what are they addressing? Why are they trying to address what they're trying to address? And then when we go back down the funnel, you got a deal that's 5 times the size, 10 times the size of what you're originally doing.
Nice. I mean, a very practical example of that is I would sell endoscopic camera systems that could be used in urology, in gynecology, in orthopedics, although another rep covered that. So we would come in and work together on those. But it would most likely, most of the time, you get the initial call to come in and speak with a surgeon would be, hey, you've just had 100 grand's worth of funding, which would buy a camera system and some endoscopes. It's so tempting just to go, the business is there, the money's there, to just jump on it. And obviously, what would my commission? My commission might be $1,000 or $2,000 from that or whatever it was, which is obviously a nice chunk of money at the end of the month because it happens so quickly with the deliverability of it. But then as soon as, and this is what I noticed from the super successful reps at the company that I worked at last, they would then literally just do as you described then they'd go to gynecology and say, hey, the urologists are getting a new camera system. Yours is a bit crappy. Why don't you have a chat with them and see what funding you can put together, and I can do you then a deal which will, reduce the costs as you described them, Richard, Steve, and then we can come together and put a bigger deal together. And the most successful reps, whereas I'd be running around Yorkshire over here in the UK like a nutter, selling an endoscope here and a camera stack there, they'd be sat with the C-suite of the hospital trust, putting together £1 million, £2 million deal that would then see them right for half the year sales target wise. And they're dealing with, how to describe it, they're having more intelligent, more interesting conversations. They're having less conversations, but perhaps there's more importance to them. And that to me, looking at them and trying to get in the position that they were in was interesting, and that's where I wanted to be. And this comes back to originally one of the original questions I asked you of the importance of conversations, the importance of having a reputation, the importance of being with a company for perhaps a number of years and the same industry to build all these links and these networks. And that was the differentiator between the people who did pretty well, all right, like I did, and the people who are really crushing it and really bringing home the huge commissions. So I'm glad you described it like that.
Can I share one one last little soundbite here from a guy named Craig? You know Craig Elias? You should really have Craig Elias on the show. He's a Canadian great guy. Um, he talks about shaping the buying vision, and it's Craig Craig Elias Elias. Shaping the buying vision, and the research from the Forresters and the corporate executive boards and serious decisions of the world and Gartner all says the same thing. The salesperson who shapes the buying vision of the decision-making committee wins the business more than 70% of the time. So this also brings back another perfect example of and story of how a salesperson can pull someone back up the funnel and then in turn get themselves a whole lot more money later on. Let's say you're in an RFP situation or you're in a competitive situation. And there's a gentleman named Tony Hughes, who's an Australian, who wrote the book, The Joshua Principle, who I'm sure you're aware of. The Joshua Principle is a great book. I think I've talked about that. And he talks about the different modes of competition. Well, you can coexist with your competition. You can do a heads up and try to beat them at their own game. Or, here's the interesting one, you can orchestrate a no decision for now, and then go back, re-entrench, shape the buying vision of that buying committee, and then have at it again in a situation where, because you've changed their criteria, you've shaped their criteria. And Matt Dixon of the Corporate Executive Board, one of the original authors of the Challenger Sale, Matt Dixon talks about how the best salespeople, when they were studying it, whenever they got an RFP, they would go back to the RFP, and rather than just answering the RFP, which is request for a proposal for those who don't know, that's when someone comes to you and says, hey, I want a proposal. Rather than just answering the RFP like some other bozo salesperson, they'd go back and say, do you want to know the 3 things that are not in your RFP that should be? Huh. Ooh. Now you're taking someone who is in an evaluation of options mode a little bit further down the funnel, and you're pulling them back up where they're starting to try to figure out again, what are our needs and why are we even doing this in the first place? And by reframing and reshaping their buying vision, that causes it so that when they go back down the funnel, it's much bigger. So there's lots of different times when you would want to do that.
And for sure, and final example for myself, because I've been doing way too much talk in this episode, but to again do that from the top of the funnel without perhaps dragging it back up, what we used to do was essentially get everyone on board, everyone's excited. Then you've got the finance people who want to do all the the procurement, the tendering process. You're doing your best to get them on board, but they're essentially being paid to be as neutral as possible. So it's a difficult one. We would almost, not almost, I don't know the legality of some of this, but we would essentially get the surgeons to commit to only asking for product specifications that only we could meet. So that the tendering process, which I think in the NHS government body, there must be legalities between how much they spend, how much tender has to go, when it has to go to tender, that kind of thing. But we would essentially manipulate all that from the top of the funnel by, as you described it, affecting the buyer's vision of what they need, want, and desire, and yeah, you're leading them to. Which is really interesting because we've done this multiple times, but I've never really talked or thought about it in depth. But you're essentially pulling them down a vision that you do with one sentence, 2 sentences, that has massive impact all the way down through tens, if not 20, 30 people all making these decisions. So it's really interesting. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that as well, because again, it's something that people perhaps who listen to the show are doing, but they may not realize the impact of it, and they may not be doing it as efficiently as what they could do, perhaps.
It's not manipulation. I keep hearing that word from you, Will, and I'm telling you, it's not manipulation. Here's what it is. If you're doing it for the wrong reasons, and then you're selling snake oil, if you're selling a scope that didn't work, that's manipulation. If we look at it as influence and persuasion. And if you look at the science of persuasion and the science of influence, and a great book every salesperson should be required to read is simply called Influence by Robert Cialdini, where they talk about all these psychology experiments. It's fascinating. I can't go into them right now. We don't have the time. We could just talk about that in an episode. But if you think about the science of persuasion and the science of influence, that's what makes the world economy go. Right? The whole reason we have a world economy is because of specialization. Some people are really good at some things and not good at others. Specialization in trade and communication. That's what it comes down to. Otherwise, we would just all have a whole bunch of clans or tribes and warring against each other like the Dark Ages. So when we talk about these kinds of things, I look at them much more. I don't look at this as a negative manipulation at all. It's helping people understand things they didn't understand before. It's idea mongering. If I'm manipulating anything, it's ideas. It's interest. It's focus. It's what's possible, where we can go, what you can achieve in everyone's individual professions through a scope or a piece of software or a piece of hardware, or whatever it might be. So I just encourage people to look at this science through the lens of what it's capable of doing for humankind, as opposed to looking at it as being somehow a manipulative tool. It really is not, for your own ends. And if you do, I don't think you should be in the profession.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe I'm using the word wrongly linguistically. Maybe there's something deep in my subconscious. I don't know what it is, but I have used it quite a few times this episode, and I, very happily and conscious free have sold this equipment. I've only ever worked for the best companies in the medical device world, and one of the biggest and best chemical companies in the world. I did chemical sales for them when I first started off. So, yeah, I probably need to do some psychoanalysis of why I'm using that word, and that'll be another conversation or follow-up question, another conversation. And with that, Steve, I'm conscious of time here, mate, but I've got a couple of questions, quick fire questions that I'd like to just throw at you, if that's cool. Good. First one, totally nothing to do with sales whatsoever. Beach holiday or snow holiday?
Snow holiday.
Nice. If dollar size, if possible, what's the biggest deal that you've ever closed?
250K.
Nice. What is the first, or how does the first 60 minutes of your day look like?
Wake up in the morning, usually do a little computer time, hit the running path. Sometimes I've got kids in tow because I've got 3 kids under 7, so I pop them in the runnings, depending on how many of them are up. Sometimes it's 1, 2, or 3, and believe it or not, we actually have a triple stroller. So sometimes I'm running with kids in a 3.5-mile loop. Sometimes I'm not. Get back, shower, get to work.
Nice. Next one and final one, because I'm conscious of time here. We're running out, because I could dive into this. I feel like I've opened more doors in this conversation than what we've managed to close, which is good, because conversations are obviously such a deep topic. But I've asked you this a couple of times, so I'm going to rephrase the question slightly. But if you could sit down with the 10 to 20,000 people who are listening to this right now, Steve, and you could sit down and spend a bit of time with them one-on-one, but you could only give them one piece of advice to help them become better at sales, what would that one piece of advice be?
Study their conversations. One thing I didn't mention about my morning routine for an hour is, while I'm running, I literally have our mobile app, the ExecVision mobile app, on my phone, and I listen to the demos, the software demos that I did earlier in the week or previous weeks. And every time I listen to myself, I pick things up and I learn more about what I'm doing well and what I could do better than any book I could read, than any sales training I could go to. You learn more just by observing yourself. It's like looking in the mirror. So you have to study your own game tape if you want to get better. Amazing.
And with that, Steve, tell us a little bit about ExecVision, where we can find out more about it, and yeah, where we can find out more about you as well.
Sure. The best thing is your listeners need to know about is our call camp. So let's not even talk about ExecVision, but let's talk about call camp. I'm building a movement called Call Camp. We just did one yesterday. We're routinely getting 1,000 to 2,000 people who are on this webinar. And during these webinars, we break down real sales calls for what works and what doesn't, just like a sports coach breaks down game film. And the big idea behind ExecVision, the software that we have, is that if you look at most sales organizations, and you compare them to being like a sports team, imagine a sports coach that couldn't even see their team. They couldn't see their team perform, and they didn't know what they did on the field. They had a blindfold on. It's insane. It's a crazy idea. But unfortunately, it's an idea that happens almost every single day in most companies. So our mission at ExecVision is to improve business conversations, improve the people who are having them, and take the blindfolds off, get it so that we have transparency, visibility into these conversations that were previously a black box. And when you do that, it's incredible how the sales performance improves very quickly. So go on to ExecVision, and there under resources is the Call Camp. And I encourage everyone to sign up for Call Camp, and you'll have a chance to hear it. And in fact, we also take questions, and in many cases, we give away prizes. So it's an awesome place for salespeople to learn how to get better, free sales training, if you will.
Amazing. We'll link to that in the show notes over at salesman.red. And with that, Steve, I want to thank you again. It's the 3rd time on the show, I think, now. Again, massively interesting conversation. We've got loads more things to talk about next time you come on. And I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
Will, thanks for doing it. You're a service for the community.
And there we have it. Steve, thank you for coming on the show, mate. I appreciate your time. Thank you. Sales Nation, as always, I say every episode, but I feel like it's important to continue to say it because it is so important. You guys keep sharing the show. You're helping us grow. You're helping us get better guests on, better studios for the audio and the video. And, it's all down to you. And I feel cheesy when I say it, but there's no other way to put it across other than you guys are making this show happen. So I appreciate that, Sales Nation. And with that all said, I'll speak with you on tomorrow's episode.